had a nice break. It's probably afternoon where most of our folks are. I know we actually have some folks from New Zealand and overseas, so I don't know what time you are, but hopefully you're still tuned in and joining us today. It's been such a rich conversation. I'm really excited for our third panel that we have here. This is our last panel before we go to our closing keynote. And what's great about this one is we're going to talk a lot about the tools on how to navigate all of this. And I know we've heard a little bit throughout, particularly from our other panels, about how should we behave and think and act and talk to people. We're going to even have so much more of that in this conversation. And how do we think critically in this complex world? I have three amazing guests joining us today. I have Davey Alba, who is a technology reporter for the New York Times, covering misinformation, online misinformation, and its harms around the world. I also have Jimmeka Anderson joining us as the founder of I Am Not the Media Incorporated. She is also finishing her Ph.D. at the University of North Carolina, again, thinking critically about the media landscape and their media literacy. And our third guest this afternoon is Christy Roschke, who is the managing director of the News Co-Lab at Arizona State University, and she has also been a longtime educator. So you will definitely hear a lot about media literacy in this, as well as other kind of conversation points. I'm really excited to listen and learn with you all. So thank you very much for being here today and for speaking with our audience. I'm going to bow out and pass this over to Davey.
Thanks very much for being here, and we hope to have a fruitful discussion. I am going to act as moderator, so I'll be kind of leading the discussion here. And you know, we've actually, Christy and Jimmeka and I have spoken before and sort of shared our views on misinformation and shared our perspectives on misinformation. And one thing that I remember telling them when we heard about the topic of this panel is I actually have kind of a pessimistic view of how to solve this knotty problem of misinformation, this seemingly endless, widespread problem of misinformation. And, you know, I've been reporting on online mis and disinformation for the Times for about 2 years, through the election, through the pandemic. It's, to me, only gotten worse in some ways. And so that was my starting point here. And I came in saying, you know, I'm kind of pessimistic about this. I just don't know where the potential solutions could lie. And my fellow panelists here had some good ideas. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Christy, first. You know, you had a good response to me being like very negative about all this.
Well, look, as we talked about before, like I often also feel very overwhelmed by this seemingly intractable problem. And I can certainly understand, as in your role as a journalist, especially where you're just uncovering, you know, the latest news peg. It's going to be, you know, it's like, it so often is something bad has happened and that's what's leading you to sort of, you know, report on it. And so I can especially see from your perspective how you just keep seeing more and more, you know, misinformation, disinformation spreading on our internet. But I, you know, where I sit as an educator, I kind of have the benefit of being able to talk to young people and teach young people some of these tools and tricks of the trade and how to, you know, be responsible, active, engaged media users. And so I get the luxury of, you know, having all kinds of conversations with people that I think I can see, you know, the individual levels of the impact it has and how we can sort of change people's minds and behaviors and understandings through education. That's just one route, but that's my route, you know, that's my lens. So I get to see you know, those aha moments where students are like, oh, you know, I never realized that when I was posting this, you know, they've gotten a lot more savvy over the years. It used to be like, I never realized everyone could see all my Facebook posts. And now I know that's not really the conversation we're having anymore. It's more like, you know, maybe that person, that influencer on TikTok, maybe you should spend some time figuring out what their credentials actually are. And so where I sit, I get to see some of those aha moments, which really, I think, helps a lot.
And you mentioned that there is some forward momentum in sort of curriculum building and things like that. Oh, I think we have Christy a little bit frozen. Maybe I'll turn it over to you, Jimmeka, and just kind of get your thoughts on how to respond to the kind of negative point of view I have on misinformation and its tentacles.
Yes, Davy, what you're experiencing is something I think a lot of viewers that are watching this webinar can probably relate to, and probably those that may not even be watching this webinar. I think that's because with most fear, it's due to uncertainty. We fear the things that we don't know. And I will tell you, today's climate in the online environment is filled with uncertainty because there's so much misinformation. You don't know what to believe. One thing can be an event, and it has all of these different perspectives and how people are angling it and pitching it. And it creates this uncertainty of who do we trust? Can we trust anything on the internet? And so, it's very valid to feel that way. I would say I am connected in the same way as Christy. I'm a media literacy educator. And so I find my hope in the work that I'm doing with youth and in the community, and seeing the benefits and the perks of how skill building and teaching media literacy skills can help someone navigate. And what it does is it helps to build confidence and competence in as you engage with content online. And so I would also say, one of the things that I have seen and have been involved in is a lot of efforts that have taken place now as a result of the challenges with misinformation. So many organizations, so many academic institutions, so many community grassroots groups are doing a lot of work to combat misinformation by teaching how to navigate online, providing resources. And so there's so much synergy right now in this media literacy space. And it's really interconnected with cybersecurity groups and policy stakeholders and everyone coming together. So that's where I'm finding my hope, through the synergy that I'm feeling with everyone that's really trying to get involved in help combat misinformation and educate youth, but I'm also getting my hope from those moments I have with students when I'm teaching them lateral reading skills, or I'm teaching them how to identify misinformation online.
Yeah, I think these skills are really important, and so are some of the groups, and we'll share some of those resources in a little bit. But, one question I have is, often people think that they can combat misinformation by doing their own research. That's something that we hear a lot, whether you're speaking to family or friends. And there's a lot of mistrust in institutions, and people feel like they can take it on themselves and find the right sources. In a way, people are saying, sort of thinking that they are coming from a point of view of educating themselves. And, it's what you guys talk about too, right? You talk about education. So how is that different? And I'll turn it over to you, Christy, first.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because it is, the language that we use for a lot of what we teach gets used in that, that converse way, or in that way of like, well, I'm going to go against the grain because the party line or the dominant narrative doesn't impact me. It doesn't affect me. Or maybe I've been burned by, there's a lot of real harm that's been done by dominant narratives over history and the institutions that support those narratives. So you can understand why people have that distrust or that tendency towards skepticism. And I think when it veers over into more cynicism, that's when you start to see the idea that these people sort of railing against the common, I'm seeing all this news today about the new Omicron variant and Dr. Fauci speaking, and you just know there's a certain a faction of people who are going to see that and will be sort of triggered in this way that I'm going to believe the opposite of that. And it's really difficult to play that game of like, I know my education's better than your education. So the approach I tend to take is talking about trying to dial it back to what are some of those cultural, social, historical contexts that have created some of this distrust. And we try to unpack that. And again, I have the luxury of doing that in a college class. I get that not everyone can do that on their own. So I'm trying to create change that's going to be long-term. Sometimes these aren't quick fixes, right? So I think it is difficult, and it's something for us to think about in terms of the way that we talk about. Again, it's not the right way or the wrong way. It's just there's a reason why there's consensus around certain scientific evidence, for instance, and your personal feeling about that doesn't trump the consensus. So we talk about how that is established. But it can be very frustrating. I agree with you. And sometimes we see that working against us. And I don't really have the best argument for that in that place, other than you have to start with kind of the systemic change in terms of teaching those practices as lifelong practices.
I want to kind of go to a point that you made before when we spoke about the need for information and the need for news, and whether or not you trust kind of these big institutions like the CDC or Fauci or something. There is an opening there, right? Because you need to know what the weather is, whether your local supermarket is having a sale or something. So you spoke about local news. Can you expound on that as a potential opening?
Yeah. Thanks for that reminder. It's true. We find that a lot of times the same person who says, I don't believe anything in the media can't be trusted, also turn to the news for vital information in their lives. And that does tend to be that information that impacts them, on the daily level, that local level. So there's sort of this existential idea of the media. And I think we find in research most of the time when people are talking about the media, they are talking about national media outlets. And oftentimes they're really specifically talking about television news, which is a whole beast to its own, as we all know. But when you start to talk about, well, what about where do you get that traffic report? Or how do you find out, where to vote in your local election, or what's going to happen with the construction on your street? Well, invariably people turn to their local news outlets. And so helping people bridge that understanding of media are not one thing. There are many, many things, and they provide many uses. They have much value in our lives for different ways. So there is an opening there. And in terms of some of the trust research, it does still turn out that local news is among the most trusted of all news outlets for that very reason. You can see its impact. It actually affects your daily life.
Jimmeka, can you expound on this notion of media as kind of different institutions, different outlets that serve sort of different purposes? How do we know who to trust among the media? Because we've got some media outlets that look like they publish straight news, and then you find out who's funding them or whether they have a specific slant. What kinds of resources do you look at to kind of decide where we should put our trust in?
Yes. So just connecting also to what you just was talking about with Christy, with people that say, I've done my research, where there's a way you can do research, but then there's a way to do effective research, right? And so because you can go find some information, but then so what I want to touch base on that is that you can do a Google search, you can do a Wikipedia search, you can go watch one news station and you'll get information, but it may not be all credible. And so you have to understand that all media is constructed. So that's something I make sure I clarify with anytime I do any kind of workshop with you students, understanding that all media is constructed. An individual actually constructed that piece of information. And I, as a media literacy educator, would argue that all media has some type of biasness to it in some form, because that individual that constructed it, their biases may have played out in it, and their perspectives and their ideologies and all of that went into the construction of that piece of media. With that being said, that's why it's very important to understand the source. And one of the things that I know I shared with you, Davey, is the media bias chart, which me as a media literacy educator, I use. If you don't know what the media literacy bias chart is, you can Google it. But what's going to be really helpful for you as an individual with understanding the media literacy bias chart is, one, seeing how the media's biases are kind of represented, but how you're connected to that in a way. So I always challenge individuals to think about their own, what we call confirmation biases that we have that exist. Because like I said, just like all media is constructed by an individual and their ideologies and their belief systems frame their biases that exist, we are the same way. So we're going to tend to like and want to lean into media that kind of relates and connects to the biases that we want them to affirm the things that we believe. And so it's really important for us to be cognizant of our own biases, but then to understand how the media that we consume, how it is biased. And so that chart is super beneficial. The media literacy bias chart. I recommend everyone to take a look at it and see the media that they're engaging with and where it falls in on that chart.
It's called Adfontes, or that's the maker? Yeah, okay. Yep. So hopefully our audience is able to look that up. It comes up pretty quickly on Google, I believe. Yep. So the next thing I want to turn to is, you know, a question of tone, which is something that I think a lot of us in the media literacy space think about a lot. You know, when there is a wealth of information and science behind a certain, you know, common wisdom recommendation, there can often be these moments, especially with the people closest to us, where it feels like, oh, how can I change your mind? And sometimes that's kind of just where our mind goes to. But you know, I at least in my reporting experience, I've found that tone matters a lot when you are approaching people. And I wanted to get maybe Christy first to expound on your thoughts on tone and how to have these conversations when people close to you seem to be buying into a false narrative.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, there's a lot of elitism in the, you know, I have the right information. I am the expert. I have the education. And that happens across institutions. I mean, that's how we've gatekept information throughout time. It's like, I have the knowledge, I will impart it to you. I mean, that's how we used to teach in the sort of that sage on the stage model. And I think we're trying to move past that in all aspects, because you know, it doesn't work anymore to say, to sort of shame people into, I'm going to, or I don't know, I will deign to give you my wisdom and you're so fortunate to have it. And a lot of times, you know, our media talk that way, our educators talk that way, our politicians talk that way, as though we're so lucky to be able to, you know, we have service of these elites. And so I think that's part of what's gotten us into this problem, you know, that we're no longer here for that. And there's enough voices online that aren't going to treat us that way, aren't going to make us feel stupid for, you know, questioning whether or not I should be vaccinated. I'm not going to feel shamed for making these decisions. And so to your point about tone, it's really important to never make anyone feel stupid for anything. You know, we have a lot of reasons, confirmation biases, life experience, you know, values that we bring to all of our decisions, and empathy and understanding how people arrive at those decisions is, you know, a really important tool. And it frustrates me when I read, you know, this idea that, you know, we all need to be protected or, you know, that sort of some of this like inoculation terminology too, in terms of like that people are otherwise not smart enough to figure out what to do. So they need to learn to be smarter. And I don't think that's right. I just think we need to approach people with empathy and try to understand where they're coming from. And we're not out. I don't feel like we can change minds. I mean, we can change minds, but like that can't be the goal. The goal is at the outside of a conversation is not, I am going to change your mind about subject X. The goal is, I want to understand your perspective. I want to share my perspective. We know that personal anecdotes are really, really compelling for both good and, you know, bad. So I think just using vaccinations as an example, when I choose to share my reasons for being vaccinated, my reasons for getting my child vaccinated, I want to just explain where I came from and then allow people to say, okay, I can see that. This is where I'm coming from. And then we come to a mutual understanding, if not changing of minds. And I just think we don't do enough of that right now. And also, you know, social media is not really geared toward that. It's really geared toward more shouting at one another. So that's just the kind of approach I try to take both in my interpersonal communication, but also in my online communication.
Jimmeka, thoughts on that? And I'm curious if you have any practical tips for people who may be sharing these things online or having conversations about these things online. You know, there's obviously the blasted out approach. There's also a way to talk privately with people, right? So are there any potential solutions there on how to go about having these conversations?
Definitely. The first thing that I would recommend, and I tell this to students that I work with, is that if you engage with misinformation online, you see a friend on your timeline or a family member on your timeline that's posted something, do not take the blasted out approach. I would say, DM them. That's when that DM becomes handy. Like, have a personal conversation off the record. There's this phrase that we used to say from my neighborhood I grew up. People get loud in front of the crowd, and so if you're coming at somebody online, like blasting them on social media, they may become defensive, and it may turn into something more than an educational, teachable moment. And so, send them a private DM and just say, "Hey, I don't know if you know this, but this is actually an article that has been deemed as misinformation." You can provide them with more information as to why, or give them the opportunity to understand, and then also allow them to share, and you share. Hey, I have been bamboozled before, because I think we all have. And so, just to kind of make someone feel comfortable versus making them feel shameful. Shaming is real online. It happens too much, but it's not an act that empowers people to feel confident even moving forward as we navigate in the space. And I think that the main goal is that we want people to feel confident and competent. So helping them understand how to identify misinformation, which you could provide that in the DM, provide a link, tell them they can check out this resource here, and then help them feel confident, say, hey, I've went through this before. I would say, when it comes to having conversations offline, because I deal with a lot of conversations with family and friends offline where they're sharing information that they got. I'm like, where did you hear that from? Where did you get that? Right. And so I like to ask questions, but that might just be the media literacy educator in me. As an educator, I seek to understand, and I keep an active, open-minded approach. And so I ask questions. And so the questions allow them to start thinking critically in their mind and processing, oh, you know what? I don't know the name of that article. Let me go research it. And is that a credible source? And so I would say, if you're dealing with family and friends offline, ask questions, seek to understand.
Yeah, those are really great tips. And one thing that is starting to emerge as a theme, I think, as we're having this conversation, is that a lot of these approaches are community-minded and on the community level. And so I wanted to kind of get either of you to expound on what you think community can provide to people who have been suckered in by misinformation. Are there any resources or sort of community-minded groups that both of you can recommend, or are in your own communities, and maybe encourage people to find parallels in their own communities of these kinds of resources?
Definitely. I will chime in, Christine, and you can as well. So one of the initiatives that I'm working on right now with the National Association of Media Literacy Education and New America in Cyber Florida is the Cyber Citizenship Initiative. And so what this is, an initiative where organizations that have come together from the cybersecurity world, ed policy world, and the educator realm of media literacy, and we have put together this hub where we've collected resources that are available to the public for free. And so educators or parents, they can actually go online at cybercitizenshipeducation.org. And you can search through about 100 resources that have been kind of compiled into a one-stop shop location for you to have those conversations, to play games and engage with your kids or with yourself, read articles, watch video content where you can educate yourself about misinformation, because a lot of people don't know about the different types of misinformation. For the longest, fake news was the buzzword. And I mean, what really is fake news, right? No, they really didn't know. They were just saying that's fake news. They didn't know the difference between misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. Oh, this is propaganda, So, educating yourself on what types of information you encounter online, and then the skills to actually know how to identify and navigate it and maneuver and read it and analyze it. And so those resources are available, cybercitizenshipeducation.org. I would also say research local nonprofits in your community that may be offering workshops, libraries. Get involved with your library. Right now, libraries are doing media literacy workshops. I'm telling you, because ALA has invested in this. They see it as an important topic to discuss and educate our community on. And so I guarantee you right now, if you look up your local library, there's probably a workshop going on within the next month or so that can provide some information to educate you about misinformation and disinformation. So that's what I would say start.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And I'll just echo that there are nonprofit organizations and like youth media groups in their communities. The Cyber Citizen.
I can't help you with iTunes on Apple Watch.
My Siri just went off. Siri doesn't know where to find these resources, but thankfully I do. So sorry about that. So your local, there's all kinds of groups that work with young people creating media. And that's a great way to get young people to kind of be more aware of like the different types of information that's out there. When you're creating media, you have more of a vested interest in how it works, how you can use messages to achieve certain effects. So there are groups that students can get involved in. There's also large nonprofits like Common Sense Media and PBS have a lot of lesson plans for educators. And that's a great way, even if you're not an educator, I think it's great for parents to think, there's a lot of room for this in school, whether it's related to misinformation specifically, or if it's more on the idea of like digital safety, which is always really important for young kids, bring it up with your kid's school. There's Common Sense has some great resources for educators. So does PBS. I also think there's a good opportunity to get involved with local media. I've been in some of my work, we've been working with news organizations to try to get them more involved in helping boost their community's media literacy, right? Because it's inherently in a journalist's best interest to make sure that their information is trusted, the information the news org is providing is trusted and valued and used in a way that you want it to be used. We can't really just assume that that's happening. And so the more the news orgs can get involved in the community to help with these kinds of issues or efforts, I think is great. And I think it's a great thing to ask your local news organization to do. There used to be a lot of initiatives like they called them news and education. I used to do this as a high school teacher where we'd get the newspaper delivered every day and we would look at the headlines. And unfortunately, a lot of those programs have gone away because of funding, like so many other things. But I think it's probably time to bring back some of that. Like, how do we get newspapers? Maybe they're not newspapers, but how do we get news back in the classroom? How can we get our local journalists, the ones who are still trusted in the community, to have more of a direct connection with the community and talk about, the important headlines of the day?
Is there an opportunity, Christy, to be more active in the community? Specifically, you talked about being activated as an influencer, perhaps even in your own community. Besides, of course, absorbing all of these good resources that both of you have suggested, what's a more active way to just be right there in the community, trying to do good?
Sure. That's a great question. I think there's a kind of the possibilities are endless, like depending on how much time and effort you want to invest. I get phone calls all the time. I don't know if this happens to you, Jimmeka, but it's just like people who are like, I'm an accountant and I'm really concerned about misinformation. How can I tell other accountants about this? And sometimes that means me coming to speak to them. Sometimes it means me, sending them some resources or having a conversation. But I think that's an important thing is that, and everybody, regardless of their profession or their place in life, is dealing with this, both kind of very specifically in their profession, maybe as it relates to them, but also sort of generally. So I think there's room for people to kind of have these conversations and think about the way they're communicating about their profession to the public. Like, this is a perfect time to learn more about that. And so I think that's a great way to get involved. I think there's lots of experts probably in the community that be willing. I think the library suggestion was a really great one, is how library training can do wonders. But I also do a lot of sort of social media training in terms of like, this is how you should communicate. There's certain types of people in the community especially now, like, people in the medical and healthcare profession, we really want to advocate for them being more public about sharing good habits and good healthcare tips, because they are influencers in the community in their own way. So I think it's you could become a trainer, or just sharing good information and leading by example is probably a pretty simple thing that you could do.
We've talked a lot about different skills that people can develop in kind of learning about misinformation and how to suss out misinformation. One thing that keeps coming up is lateral reading. Jimmeka, can we pause here and explain what lateral reading actually means, and maybe any other skills you have to suggest to our audience to kind of help us think through this problem?
Yeah, so lateral reading is a skill that researchers have defined. I know one of the leading research groups at Stanford, Stanford History Education Group, SHEG, they created a program called CORE, Critical Online Reasoning. And it's one of the key skills that they actually identified as being effective with combating misinformation. And so what they discovered through their research is that they actually did a study where they pulled actual journalists and looked at how they actually determine information is credible, how they actually engage with information and do fact checking. And so they looked at professional fact checkers, journalists, and then just other individuals in careers. And what they noticed is that these fact checkers and journalists, they engage in this skill called lateral reading, which is now deemed. What they do is they actually pull up multiple screens. So usually when we engage online with information or an article, we actually read linear, up and down. Like we just go to a website and we just read it up and down. And then it's like, oh, we're done. We did all of our reading, right? But you don't know if what you read was true. So what you do is you pull up that screen and then you read, and then you say, oh, okay, here's something interesting. Let me pull up another screen. Let me see what this website may say about this. Let me look up this. Oh, they just brought up an organization or a company. Oh, I just see that this was created by so-and-so. Let me Google who this person is. So then you pull up these different screens, and what you do is you go across the screens and you identify that kernel of truth. And so now you're able to really get the big picture of if an article is credible, who's connected to it, who wrote it, who that person is. And now you kind of can really understand the whole picture. So lateral reading is basically pulling up multiple screens and reading across screens versus reading up and down linear in an article.
Any other skills that you both can sort of recommend, or, that people invest their time into? There's obviously a source of information, and just understanding how the platforms work, how misinformation spreads, things like that. Skills to sharpen in fact checking, or even maybe data literacy. Could either of you expound on some of these things that we should all be seeking to educate ourselves on?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I'm sure that Jimmeka has others as well. And I think the lateral reading is great because it's kind of fundamentally just sort of describing how we learn differently when we're online, and that's how it should be, right? So, you often hear people say, like, there's not one source of information that I trust. I'm never going to trust one thing. And you can look at that as a bad thing. Like, well, that's, people are too skeptical. They don't trust any one thing. But I think it's kind of more of a product of, like, we can open as many tabs as we want to find as many different ways to talk about something as possible. And that's just kind of online learning. It's not necessarily a bad thing that you'll read one article in a newspaper or on a news site and think, I want to see if someone else is saying the same thing. I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. I just think that's the curiosity that's afforded by online learning, So doing that lateral reading just kind of sets a foundation. It's a norm. It's a habit that you can adopt that just makes you better, well-rounded. And I guess a couple of things I would add to that, and something I do with my students, is Wikipedia is a great place for that quick fact check. Wikipedia is not infallible. It's not perfect. There's a lot of things that are not great about it. But as a community edited vetted, fact-checked source, it's pretty spot on most of the time, especially for big things. You'll come across lesser traveled pages and you're like, this seems a little, and there'll even be a banner across the top that says like, this page needs some work. But for big things, it's really good resource for, Jimmeka made the example of, you're reading something and you think, what is this organization? I am always searching Wikipedia for names of organizations, names of think tanks, names of, political sounding organizations. I'm like, this sounds like Freedom for America sounds great, but what is Freedom for America? And then I look it up and Wikipedia will tell me this is a partisan think tank or whatever it is. And that helps it gives a additional context to what I'm looking at. So I think a lot of people think Wikipedia is not a reliable source. I know my students tell me that all the time. The funny thing about that is it's almost invariably the first search result that comes back on Google. Most of the info boxes that you see, those knowledge graphs on a Google search page, come from Wikipedia. And so people are actually consuming Wikipedia, I think, a lot more than they think they are, because they've been told in school, don't use Wikipedia as a source in a research paper. Well, sure, that's great. But as a source for a spot check on something, I think and it takes 2 seconds to do it. So I think that's one thing I think is useful for people. And then another kind of habit, it's less a tactic, it's more of a habit or a norm that you should adopt. And this comes from Mike Caulfield's SIFT, which is it's like an offshoot of lateral reading. It uses lateral reading in this fun acronym, but the S in SIFT is stop. And so one of the habits I try to teach my students is, before you share something or even like something on social media, something that would indicate to others that you had a reaction to this piece of information, make sure you know what this piece of information is, because it's a part of you're putting your reputation on the line. I don't mean to be so dire about it, but it is a statement that you're making by endorsing a piece of information. So if you're not clear whether something is credible or not, and if you don't want to take the time to fact check it, at least don't share it. Don't put it out into the world further than it needs to be. And if it's important enough to you that you want to take the time to fact check it, then you can move on to the lateral reading. And then if it checks out,
sports, shows, and news.
Then you can check that out for yourself, and then you can feel confident, sharing something. Because even though people will put in their Twitter bios, retweets do not equal endorsements, they totally do, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, something that I often find myself engaging with when I'm covering misinformation is even hitting that like button is part of the calculation that goes into the algorithm, right? That signals that this piece of content is popular, so it'll rise up higher in someone's feed. Jimmeka, you before mentioned about the importance of data literacy in misinformation and sort of combating misinformation. Why is that so important? And what should we kind of be seeking to have at least a base level understanding of in terms of being able to read data, and maybe also like algorithms, like I was just talking about. How should we be educating ourselves?
Yes, before I tell you that, I just was thinking about Chrissy talking about lateral reading when she was speaking, and I was like, you know what? I wonder if there's a term called lateral shopping, because that's exactly what I do online. I pull up a screen, look at one price, look at the other price, look at the other price, and compare until I get what's best. But yeah, that it made me think. I'm like, we naturally do, but majority of us naturally do that now, right? We compare the prices online. So, I'm so sorry I got off tangent, but data literacy. Yep. So most information online, a lot of us don't know how to identify whether or not it's credible or factual information. And usually one of the signifiers for that is numbers, data, actually things that we can actually go look and prove and find. And so what we're seeing a lot now, even with news reporters, is that they will project information that sounds as if it's credible information, like there's been an increase in crime in this neighborhood, or, and so you hear those terms like increase and decrease. And so what it does is it makes people say, oh, that must be true. And so they'll believe it, even though it may not be true. And so it's important for people now to understand the importance, especially with everything that's been going on with COVID, because numbers have been getting thrown around and there's an increase and you're seeing graphs and charts and you're like, whoa, what does this mean? And some people, it may be intimidating, right? It's like, okay, I don't know what's happening here. All I'm seeing is graphs and increase, right? And so it's really important at this state that we're seeing now for people to understand how to read data online to determine whether or not something is credible and factual information. So what data literacy does is helps us as individuals understand where to go to find the numbers. A reporter said crime has increased in your community. You go and look up the data about crime in your city, and you notice that it's the same as it was 5 years ago. So technically, no, this was something that was said that was jarring, just like any other misinformation we see online, to get us to tune in and listen and watch. And so now you have the tools and the skills to identify, you know what, that's not true, because I know how to go and fact check and see the numbers and find the numbers. And so right now we're seeing that it's very vital in our community for people to be educated about data. I remember when COVID first hit, there was something going around on social media in the Black community that was saying Black people were immune to COVID. And so, having the understanding, and then people were even making constructed graphs and charts on there. And I remember there was one, and it was showing Black communities, and it was like as if no one was being impacted by COVID. And so I think that it's really important for people to be able to understand data, to understand graphs, and to be able to identify when graphs and numbers are being manipulated online.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we'll see also in a lot of viral pieces of misinformation that it'll be based on a study, something that looks like a study, right, but isn't peer-reviewed or isn't thorough. And so I think that's a really good point. There's another thing that comes up quite often in my reporting, which I'll share, the vaccine adverse event reporting system. That is, it was founded as an early warning system to flag problems with vaccines, but now every single case in there has been taken out of context and, spread as if the vaccines are not effective, which is the wrong reading of that data. So it's great to have, these skills to signify at least some sense of when something is something you should take a look at closer. One audience question, actually. What are your tips when people feel overwhelmed by the wealth of information and don't have that much time to do research or lateral reading? Christy, let me ask you that first.
Sure.
To Jimmeka.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just say for starters, no one needs to be engaged with news and information as much as they are able to, right? So the first thing I say is turn off the alerts, turn off mobile alerts. You don't need push notifications. I'm sorry, I know you work for a news organization, and push notifications are important, but for most people, that constant reminder of breaking news is stressful. And so, I think it's perfectly okay to think about getting news at specific times in the day, just like we used to before the internet. Find habits and routines that work for you so that you can prevent the overwhelmingness isn't going to go away, because the amount of information is never going to be less than it is today. It's only going to be more, because at some point soon we'll have it coming into our, our VR eyeglasses that we're wearing all around. So, or it'll just be a chip in our brain. So instead we have to come up with habits for ourselves. I don't check my phone in the morning anymore, because I realized at a certain point into COVID that it just wasn't working for me. So now I start my day, and then I'm more intentional about the things I'm looking at. So that's the first thing. The first thing is to remember that we have control over the information that we consume, and we can turn off things that aren't working for us. I would recommend not having cable news on your television all day long. These aren't great for our mental and emotional states. And then I also think you don't need You don't need to research everything. There are more credible sources of information out there than ever before. The vast majority of the information that is readily available to us is going to be decently credible. That's just like the truth. So much of what we hear is all the bad stuff. And of course, the bad stuff exists and it's incredibly harmful and it's incredibly detrimental. But the truth is, most of the information that comes from professional news organizations, if we're talking about news, is going to be credible. You really don't have to research everything. I recommend doing the research when it's something that you really care about, or Jimmeka mentioned early on, uncertainty. When you feel that feeling of uncertainty adds stress, right? So when you want to try to be more certain about something, a decision you have to make, or something that you keep hearing, that's when you do the research. But it's really, it would be futile to try to tell someone to research everything. That's ridiculous, And so, I mean, I really do take a headline at its word most of the time, because I have using that, the bias chart that Jimmeka mentioned and other, just my experience with news organizations, I don't question most things unless it's really important to me, or unless it kind of, raises a red flag and I want to get, the Times said this, what does the Post say? What does the Arizona Republic say? And then I'll kind of do that. But I think it's really easy to be overwhelmed by the idea that we're supposed to be overwhelmed. And sometimes it's just good to just take a step back and be like, okay, no, this is fine. I'm fine.
How about you, Jimmeka? What are your thoughts on the flood of news and information coming our way on all the things that are affecting us now, especially the pandemic? And, we've got an election coming up next year that will be another flood for sure.
Yes. So some quick tips, because I have people that say that all the time. Okay, I don't have that much time to do all of that, right? And so some quick tips that I give is, one, pay attention to the headline. Is it something that is trying to make you react? Is it emotional grabbing? Is it jarring? Is it basically, is it clickbait? Like it makes you want to react. Okay. So if you do react to it, right? So say, you know what? I did. They pulled me in. I did it. All right. So now look at the source. Like, does the website even look like, does it look like a shoddy website? Does it look credible? Is it a website you ever heard of before? You know what I mean? And so those are some quick things that you can say, okay, this may be sketchy. Read the article. Read it. Because most of the time people share stuff because of the headline. I'm like, yo, did you even read this article? You shared it and it really has nothing to do with this headline. This headline was just a grab and pull. And so now people are sharing something and misinformation is being populated because the headline is skewed, or, it's provoking. And so read it. Look at the date. Just look at the date of the article. I give an example with my kids. I say, if I say Davy got suspended from school today. No, got suspended from school. I don't say today. Davy got suspended from school. Can you believe it? And they're like, oh my gosh, like Davy got suspended. But what if Davy actually got suspended a year ago? You know what I mean? From school. It's different. It doesn't mean the same thing. And so people are getting excited and, reactive with an article that may be outdated, that was created 4 years ago and is now being shared as if something just happened recently. So look at the date, look at the title. Is it jarring? Does it look like clickbait? Look at the web address where it come from. Those are quick tips where you can kind of, eye whether or not something may be sketchy or misinformation.
And if I can you just made me think of something that I'll just add to that, which is there's a lot of work on the part of news organizations and social media platforms, frankly, to help us do some of that. So some of the things that you can look out for that are going to come from trusted professional news organizations that you aren't going to see from non-trusted news organizations are things like, pointing out that an article is old. So I see the New York Times doing this. This is on social. When a post is shared that's from 2019, The Guardian does this really well. They label the stories. There's a reason why you recirculate evergreen content, right? But to Jimmeka's point, when you're not paying attention to the date, it can lose some of its context. And so now you'll see prominently from 2018. So it's like it's still relevant, but it's not of the now. So looking out for the date, and again, a lot of social cards are doing that now. That makes it easier. a lot more news organizations are using bylines and linking to reporters' bios. And that's helpful to get to know the person who's writing the story and what experience they have and why they might be, qualified to report on this. And just to know that there's actually, I think more importantly, to know there's a person behind the words or the audio piece. So that's something that news organizations are doing to just kind of prove like, hey, we're people out here doing our best to bring you credible information. Sites that aren't into that aren't going to spend the time to do that. And then the thing about headlines, I mean, this is a real problem with headlines. A lot of the time, it's just important to remember that news organizations write clickbait headlines for a reason, and it's a financial reason. And it's this unfortunate state of journalism being a business and needing to make money. And in a digital world, a lot of that money comes from us clicking through so that we can see advertising. And I mean, news has always been funded by advertising. This is just a different way to do that. And headlines have always been sensational for that reason. So it's important to remember that headlines are going to be often skewed or there to provoke emotion for us to get our attention. So to Jimmeka's point, read the story, because the stories are usually much more measured and balanced or fair or whatever than the headline often indicates. And so that's just like an important thing to remember. And a lot of times the reporter's not writing the headline. I mean, the headlines are written for a social audience, and it's just kind of good to know how these decisions get made so that you can understand that a clickbaity headline doesn't mean the news organization's not trustworthy, or it doesn't mean that they have a bias. It means that they're trying to catch our attention. And, that's how we do it. That's how it's always been done. One other thing about that is that a lot of news orgs are starting to label news and opinion much more clearly on social media. And to the point about sharing a story when you haven't read it, that happens all the time with op-eds, editorials that are absolutely designed to evoke emotion and to get people riled up about something, but it's different when that's the purpose versus it's a straight news story with the purpose of informing. And so those labels, I think have helped a lot. Maybe it doesn't stop people from sharing, but at least gives you the context right there in the headline that this is a person's opinion, not a story that like Davey has reported, for instance.
I love that you guys are going into these specifics because I think about it all the time. And I'll share that last year during the presidential election, there were moments where some of our top stories of the day was, a 1980 something article of Joe Biden losing the presidential election. So of course that was circulated when it was relevant for the purposes of it. And then shortly after that we saw it over and over, we instituted this label of when it was published. So that's really important. Also add that I think the headline problem, besides of course trying to be attention grabbing to sort of cater to an audience and give you like the carrot so that you'll read the whole thing, right? Is sometimes it's short on time, deadlines, like all of those things are the reality of the news publishing business. So sometimes a headline is not as nuanced as it could be. So all of those things, it can be messy, and we're fallible humans working this job and trying to adhere to the best ethics and standards of news publishing that we can.
I was going to say, I remember when I first started I Am Not the Media over 10 years ago, and I was interviewed by a local journalist about the organization and how it got started. And they were asking me all these questions. Like, I was telling them, I dealt with issues with body image and things like that. But it was so much more to that interview. And then when it hit the paper, the headline read, Media Literacy nonprofit to help kids created thanks to a pair of butt pads. And I was just like, did it make people read it? Probably. But I was just like, okay, that headline. So, yeah, I can see, and then when people actually read it, they would see there was so much more to it. And, I just was sharing my experiences, and lo and behold, it was in the headline.
I love that story. And so one question I have for you both, maybe we can wrap it here since I know we're coming short on time, is we've talked a lot about the local level, the community level, what you can do in the groups that you're in. How can we help people understand and contextualize national organizations? I think that's a lot of the times where we'll see a deep mistrust from an audience, whether it's a national news media organization or the CDC or a figure you see on CNN all the time or on, the presidential briefings at the time, like Fauci. How can we help people understand this national level sort of feeding of information to an audience and when it is or isn't reliable? Christy, maybe you have some thoughts?
I mean, that's a good question and a big one. And there's a couple of things. And I think there's a different approach. I have different recommendations for if we're talking about like adult media audiences versus what we can do in education. So for the adults who are now hearing these briefings and are now maybe hearing about the CDC, I mean, everyone knows what the CDC is at this point, or at least is familiar with the acronym. Whether or not they know what it is a different story, but probably most people did not know about the CDC before COVID. And so it's important to remember that we don't all have this like long historical personal context with organizations like the CDC or the FDA. But now they're like literally impacting our lives. And so, I think I don't know that we can turn back time, but helping people to understand what these organizations do, who is in these organizations, not just the figureheads of these organizations, because actually they're probably the least important people, right? It's the people who are doing the testing and setting the standards and writing the reports, why they do what they do, what these government groups were set up to do, why they're the ones that make these decisions for us and why it works that way and why it does work. And other examples that are like less controversial, like all of the things the CDC does that we're totally cool with. I can't name anything right now, but I'm sure there are lots of things, all the ways the FDA makes sure we're not eating poisonous food. And that's cool, but when the FDA is approving drugs, then that all of a sudden freaks people out. So I think it's important for people in those positions to recognize that they're not household names. They weren't before this, and so then to come on the scene and be like, oh, here we are with all your answers, like you should have expected some pushback there, right? So again, maybe we can't go back in time, but I think context for everything is always so important. Again, getting over this elitist mentality of like, I'm the czar of this thing, therefore you should listen to me. Like that's not how we operate. And it's in a time when I can go on any website and find a counter opinion. I need to understand how your consensus organization works and who are all the great minds behind the decisions that are being made. And that's my tip for education as well, especially in science. We learn how to do labs. I don't know. I took science in high school and I don't know, learned how to mix chemicals. I barely remember it, but I certainly didn't learn about the Food and Drug Administration in my high school chemistry class. And I probably should have, because then I would go, that would have been more valuable to me maybe than like whatever chemical compounds I mixed and I don't remember. And I certainly couldn't duplicate now. I think science, we need to know more about the business of science, the process of science, the institution, what institutional science is and its impact on society. And that should be taught in schools as much as like force equals mass times acceleration, which I think is a thing I learned. And that's right. I'm not sure, but
I think that's right. Let's not spread misinformation on this panel. But that is right. Jimmeka, any thoughts to sort of close us out? I know that we are coming up on the hour.
Definitely. I mean, Chrissy, I think provided some great recommendations. I would encourage everyone to just assess their media diet. What is it that you're consuming, and how much of it you are consuming? And if it's certain media stations, utilize that media bias chart. Also be aware of whether or not the media, because a lot of the times, a lot of the journalists that we're seeing, a lot of the information they're providing is skewed and opinion based. And I know for me, even my mother, she loves watching certain news stations and she has her favorite people to watch and their commentary, they provide their commentary and their opinions, and then their opinions become her opinions. And so just being aware whether or not you're actually searching for truth. And I think that that's one of the things that I encourage my friends and family to ask themselves, like, are you really trying to seek truth? And if you are, Truth isn't in opinions. You actually got to go find the credible information. You have to pull the kernels of truth. I do like to listen to certain commentarians and, online, but I do want to look and see what's happening. What they said this, well, let me see what this news station said, and let me see what this article or this news outlet said, and find that kernel of truth. So I just empower and encourage everyone to seek truth online. And that's it.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. And thank you both for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience with us. We really appreciate the time.
Ditto. Thank you, Davey, too. Thank all three of you. That was a great discussion. I feel so much better after listening to all of you. So, Davey, I was with you at the beginning, right? It's just like, it's hard, it's complex, it's challenging, I'm overwhelmed, I feel that there's no hope. And so this was actually quite helpful for me. So I personally am thankful to all of your time today. It was such a great discussion. It was lovely getting to meet and work with y'all too. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you to our audience. We'll be back here in 15 minutes for our closing keynote with Imran Abed from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. So hopefully you'll join us back here for our closing thoughts. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in 15.
Thanks, everyone.